Let's bring in and go back to the beautiful palace, the former site of the Stock Exchange of Paris, and speak to Catherine Norris-Trent, our correspondent. Watching that, combative at times, the elephant in the room, Banco's ghost, if you will, as well, the lack of Russia being there. He was asked about that. How can a major player on an oil and gas level not be there? What did you make of his response?
Yeah, that was really interesting, wasn't it? Because you got a sense of some of the really complex geopolitics behind this as well. We're saying everything is interlinked, basically, at this summit. That's been one of the main messages coming through in the past day and again this morning. So we've been talking about, biodiversity, climate change being linked with economic development. But of course, geopolitics is there. And that's something that really came through very strongly in that interview. It's a difficult one, isn't it? Because Emmanuel Macron is not going to invite a delegation from the Russian government to Paris, given the political situation and given France's, very outspoken support for Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky. But can you ignore that elephant in the room? Well, he says that, you go through the multilateral systems, the BRICS and things which do involve Russia, and you treat it like that. I think people will have a bit of scepticism about that, and long term, of course, you need all the major players on the world stage engaged in the fight against climate change. So that's something that will probably move going in the years forward as we see what happens with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But it's a tricky point. I thought it was really interesting when he touched again on Russia's involvement in Africa, because people looking at this summit have been saying, sure, Macron can be sincere on economic development, on fighting climate change. It's clear that he really wants to advance the agenda on those, but he's also looking at the geopolitical situation in Africa. France's traditional kind of zone of influence, if you like, in Francophone Africa, well, that's been receding. There's a lot of anti-French sentiment in former colonies in Francophone Africa. As we saw, China's been coming in massively to finance African countries, and we've seen also Russia gaining a foothold there very strongly with the Wagner military group and other places, in places like the Central African Republic. So, of course, France is going to have one eye as well on trying not to lose a complete grip, and the international community not losing a complete grip on what is going on in Africa, and not just seeing those economies becoming at the mercy of China or Russia. So, the geopolitics behind this is key. It's the elephant in the room, but it's of course very present in all of these things, and the diplomacy is a big part of this summit.
I've spoken about this before, Catherine. The one pointed question that we heard here was, if Putin calls, you're in the room, do you take the call? He said he would take the call. I mean, this is a president who has been criticised internationally for trying to have a dialogue in the midst of, or the beginning of the invasion, thinking that would work. And it's how to play that. But he seems to say that right now, he didn't expect to get a call, but you have to keep that geopolitical conversation in play.
Yeah, that was a really interesting point in this interview. And you're right, just before Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, Macron was pretty much criticised by some watchers of the situation for, remember, travelling to Moscow, sitting at the end of that very long table, meeting with Vladimir Putin and not coming away with very much at all. But his stance has always been, look, we need to keep the door open. At some point, there needs to be dialogue. And in about May 2022, after the full-scale invasion had started, he ruffled a lot of feathers, especially in Ukraine, when he spoke in a newspaper interview saying that there was a need not to humiliate Putin and that there needed to be kind of an off-ramp for this conflict. And people saying, look, you can't use those kind of terms when you're talking about Vladimir Putin and with the action that he's pursuing. But at the same time, Macron's got this kind of vision of realpolitik, of trying to look for a way out of this crisis. It's really interesting, I thought he said it's not the time right now. The time is now it's Ukraine's counter-offensive. But at some point, there will have to be talks, but he underlined, on Ukraine's terms, because the Ukrainians are very fearful about being pushed into negotiations which basically involve them conceding their territory. And they say that would set a terrible precedent for countries basically having to give in to an aggressor who invades, and then basically you're forced to negotiate and freeze those lines of conflict. So Macron there, very clear to say it has to be on Ukraine's terms. The peace plans we've seen China coming up with, or the African states, don't seem to be along those lines. So, the road to diplomacy there, we're certainly not there yet.
Interesting. Catherine, while you were talking, Thomas, shaking your head a little bit, do you think it's unfair, some of the international pressure on Macron for trying to reach out to Putin?
No, that's not the point. What is unfair is to say that he said, quote, he would take the call. That's absolutely not what did he say. He said it's not time for any calls.
He didn't expect it.
I don't expect, but I don't have anything to say to Putin. What I have to say is that he is supporting the counter-offensive of Ukraine, and once the counter-offensive is done, there should be talks at some point.
Yeah,
under Ukrainian terms, which changes everything, saying we will talk under Ukrainian terms. It makes a huge difference. This difference has happened. There has been a tipping point at the GlobSec summit in Bratislava of our months, and it changes all. And look at it much in depth. This summit is all about equality and partnership between interdependent countries, northern developed economies, developing economies, and least developed economies. It's all about equality and partnership. And he said there is only one colonialist power in the 21st century. It is Russia. It is Russia. He said there is one colonialist power within the 21st century. And he said it so because this country is not invited because he is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. This country should be at the basics of what the international order is meant to achieve, stability of peace, to make sure that economic, social, and environmental issues can be tackled rightly. What is at stake, I would say, beneath this summit, is that peace is shaking, war is looming, and this is preventing it. It is adding fuel to another fire. And while war is happening in Ukraine because of the aggression of Russia, the world is shaking. The consequences on our economies, our societies, and our ability to tackle climate disruptions is hampered. And this colonialism in Ukraine is having an impact all across the globe. If you look at inflation in many countries due to the war in Ukraine, it has risen at a point where loans are no longer possible. Some allies of Russia, they can't even make it a day. Venezuela, look at this, how Venezuela inflation has happened. Look at Turkey, the inflation in Turkey. The attitude of the colonial attitude of Russia has had a global financial impact that makes this irrelevant to have any call with Putin, any Russian delegate at the summit.